The hardware store owner in Chalice leaned against his counter and told the young woman with the 6-year-old daughter that trying to grow vegetables in a cave was the stupidest waste of money he'd seen in 20 years of selling supplies. He wasn't alone. By September, the entire town was talking about the abandoned wife who'd lost her mind digging in the hillside instead of finding proper work. They called it everything from a fool's errand to slow suicide. Some laughed, others whispered pity. But when February's cold locked the valley at 20 below zero and gardens lay frozen under 4 feet of snow, something impossible happened inside that limestone cave. Tomatoes ripening, lettuce growing, warmth without burning fuel, and fresh food when the nearest vegetables were 200 miles away in Boise. Today, you'll understand why the worst idea became the most vital resource in Custer County, and how a structure everyone mocked fed 20 families through the hardest winter in living memory, while teaching a town that survival sometimes requires trusting the person everyone doubts most. Sarah Mitchell stood at the base of a limestone cliff in August 1956, holding her daughter's hand and looking at the shallow cave entrance her grandfather had shown her as a child. She was 28 years old, recently abandoned by a husband who'd left for Montana with another woman 3 months earlier. And she had exactly $340, a daughter named Emma, and a teaching certificate from a college in Pocatello that meant nothing in a town where the school already had teachers. The divorce papers had arrived in July with a note that said simply, "You'll be fine. You always figure things out." No apology, no child support, no forwarding address. Sarah's parents were dead. Her grandfather was dead. Her only sibling, a brother, was stationed in Germany with the army. She had Emma, who asked every night when Daddy was coming home, until Sarah finally told her he wasn't, and a small rental house in Chalice that cost $45 a month, money she didn't have past September. She'd applied for every job in town: store clerk, diner waitress, ranch hand. No one was hiring. Or rather, no one was hiring a woman with a small child and a reputation for being too educated. Teaching jobs went to men with families to support. Women's work went to women without complications. Sarah had both education and complications. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory from 15 years ago, standing in this same spot. Limestone breathes but holds temperature. Water seeps but never floods. And the earth stays 55 degrees year-round, 6 feet down. He'd been a mining engineer before he died, a man who understood geology the way most people understood weather. Sarah had dismissed it as old man talk. Now, standing here with no husband, no job, and a daughter to feed through winter, she remembered every word. The cave wasn't deep, maybe 30 feet into the hillside, with a ceiling height that varied from 6 feet at the entrance to 8 feet at the back. Previous owners, decades ago, had used it for root cellar storage. The entrance faced south, partially shielded by a rock overhang. A small spring emerged from a crack in the back wall, trickling water year-round. The temperature inside, even in August heat, was noticeably cooler than outside. Sarah had read about geothermal greenhouses in a library book, experimental structures in Iceland and Norway where they used Earth's stable temperature and captured sunlight to grow food year-round. The concept was simple: dig into the earth, insulate the structure, capture and store solar heat, and create a microclimate independent of outside weather. Nobody in Idaho was doing it. Most people didn't believe it was possible. Sarah believed in physics. She spent August measuring, planning, calculating. The cave provided natural insulation, stable ground temperature, and protection from wind. What it lacked was light and additional heat. She needed to capture sunlight, store thermal energy, and create a growing environment that could sustain plants through winter darkness and cold. By September, she'd started work. The criticism started immediately. Frank Morrison, who ran the general store, made his opinion clear when Sarah came in to buy materials. "You're spending money on what? Building a garden in a cave?" He looked at Emma, sitting quietly on a stool by the counter, then back at Sarah. "That child needs food and winter clothes, not her mother chasing fantasies." Sarah bought lumber, nails, and glass panes salvaged from a demolished church in Clayton. Morrison shook his head and made change. "Your husband was a fool to leave, but at least he had sense enough to know when something won't work."
Sarah took her purchases and left without responding. Not everyone was hostile. Jack Hendricks, who owned a small ranch 5 miles north, came by the cave site in mid-September. He'd heard about the project from Morrison, who'd told it as a cautionary tale about grief making people irrational. Jack was 34, widowed 3 years earlier when his wife died in childbirth along with their son, and he'd learned that grief made people do many things, but rarely made them stupid. He'd spent those 3 years working his ranch alone, declining his family's suggestions to sell and move back to Boise, declining the town's attempts to set him up with unmarried women, declining everything except the work that kept him moving forward. He understood what it meant to survive by building something when everyone expected you to collapse. He found Sarah digging, expanding the cave entrance to create more space for planting beds.
Her hands were blistered, her shirt soaked with sweat, and she was attacking the work with an intensity that spoke of desperation converted to purpose. Emma sat nearby, playing with rocks she'd arranged into careful patterns, occasionally looking up to make sure her mother was still there. Jack stood at the cave entrance for a moment before speaking, not wanting to startle them. "What are you building?" Jack asked. Sarah straightened, wiping sweat from her face. Defensive wariness crossed her expression, the look of someone expecting another lecture. "A winter garden, geothermal growing space." Jack looked at the cave, at the lumber stacked nearby, at the glass panes wrapped in burlap. He saw immediately what she was attempting. "In the cave?" Sarah nodded, still wary. "The earth stays warm below frost line. If I can capture sunlight and insulate properly, I can create a growing environment that doesn't depend on outside temperature." Jack was quiet for a moment, thinking through the thermodynamics. That's actually smart. The temperature surprise in Sarah's expression was immediate and visible. "Most people are telling me I'm insane." Jack shrugged. "Most people think conventional is the same as correct. You're working with physics, not against it. If the math works, it'll work." He paused, then asked carefully, "You need help?" Sarah hesitated, studying him. She'd learned to be suspicious of help that came with expectations. "I can't pay." "I'm not asking for pay," Jack said. "I'm asking if you need help." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, weighing risk against necessity. Emma looked up from her rocks, watching the adults with the careful attention of a child who'd learned that adult conversations determined her security. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Yes," she said. "I need help." Over the next 6 weeks, Jack became a regular presence at the cave. He helped expand the entrance, digging carefully to preserve the structural integrity of the limestone. He built wooden framing for a south-facing glass wall that would capture sunlight. He hauled 55-gallon drums from an abandoned gas station, which Sarah filled with water to create thermal mass that would absorb heat during the day
and release it at night. The work was methodical and precise. Sarah designed the layout based on her understanding of heat transfer and plant biology. The glass wall angled to catch low winter sun. Behind it, she built raised planting beds filled with composted manure, topsoil, and sand. The water barrels lined the north wall, painted black to absorb maximum heat. She insulated the cave entrance with straw bales covered in canvas, creating an airlock that prevented cold drafts. The limestone walls provided natural insulation, but Sarah lined them with salvaged wool blankets for additional thermal protection. At the back of the cave, she built a small rocket stove, more efficient than a traditional fireplace, which could provide supplemental heat on the coldest nights using minimal wood. Emma helped where she could, carrying small tools, organizing seeds, learning her mother's determination through observation. Town opinion solidified against the project. At the diner in Chalice, the cave garden became a running joke. Helen Porter, whose husband owned the feed store, spoke loudly enough for Sarah to hear when they crossed paths. Building a cave garden with a man who isn't her husband. Shameful. And that poor child, watching her mother make a fool of herself. Jack heard the comments too. He ignored them, focused on the work. When Sarah apologized for the gossip, he said simply, "People talk because they're uncomfortable with anything that challenges their assumptions. Let them talk." By late October, the structure was complete. The glass wall captured sunlight, heating the interior to 75 degrees on sunny days, even when outside temperatures dropped to 30 degrees. The water barrels absorbed this heat, stabilizing temperature swings. At night, the stored heat radiated slowly, keeping the cave at 58 to 62 degrees. Sarah planted cold hardy crops, lettuce, spinach, kale, carrots, radishes, and, experimentally, 2 tomato plants. The growing season outside had ended. Inside the cave, seedlings emerged within days. The first harvest came in November. Small but real. Radishes, lettuce, spinach leaves. Sarah brought them to the schoolhouse where Emma attended classes, a lunch that didn't come from a can or a root cellar. The teacher, Mrs. Peterson, examined the fresh lettuce with confusion. "Where did you get fresh greens in November?" Sarah told her. Mrs. Peterson's expression shifted from confusion to skepticism. "You're growing vegetables in a cave. In winter." Sarah showed her a radish, dirt still clinging to it, harvested that morning. Mrs. Peterson took it, turned it over in her hands, and said carefully, "If this actually works, you should show people." Sarah shook her head. "People have already decided it won't work. Showing them evidence won't change their minds. It'll just make them angrier that they were wrong." December brought serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero. Snow piled 5 feet deep. The town settled into winter routine, burning wood, eating preserved food, waiting for spring. Inside the cave, the temperature held steady at 60 degrees. The tomato plants, improbably, began to flower. Jack visited twice a week, bringing firewood for the rocket stove, checking the structural integrity of the glass wall under snow load, and increasingly, staying for dinner. Sarah cooked simple meals on the rocket stove, fresh vegetables mixed with beans and rice, warm food in a warm space while outside the world froze. Emma began calling him Mr. Jack, then just Jack, and eventually started saving drawings to show him when he visited. The shift in their relationship was gradual and unspoken. Jack fixed a crack in the glass wall and stayed to help Sarah transplant seedlings. Sarah made extra food, and Jack stayed to eat. They talked about practical things at first: soil composition, thermal dynamics, the engineering challenges of growing food in darkness. But slowly, in the quiet moments between work, they began talking about lonelier things. Jack told her about his wife, Anna, who'd wanted 3 children and gotten neither herself nor one child through the delivery. About how the ranch felt too big and too quiet after. How work became the only thing that made sense when nothing else did. Sarah told him about her husband, Tom, who'd always looked past her towards something else, someone else. Something more exciting than a wife who read engineering books and asked too many questions. About how the abandonment hurt less than the years of feeling insufficient had. Emma was the bridge between them, unconsciously facilitating what adults made complicated. She started showing Jack her rock collections, then her drawings. Then she started saving questions for him, things she'd normally ask her mother, as if testing whether he'd stay or disappear like her father had. Jack answered every question seriously, never condescending, treating a 6-year-old's curiosity as legitimate inquiry. "Why do plants need light?" Emma asked one evening. Jack explained photosynthesis using the tomato plants as examples, showing her how leaves captured energy. Sarah watched them and felt something she hadn't felt in years. The possibility that her family could be more than just 2 people holding on. One December evening, a week before Christmas, Jack arrived at the cave with a small, carved wooden horse for Emma. He'd made it himself, sanded smooth, simple but carefully crafted. Emma clutched it immediately and asked if she could name it. "Of course," Jack said. "What will you call it?" She thought seriously. "Limestone," she decided, "like the cave." Jack laughed, surprised and delighted. "That's a perfect name." Sarah watched this exchange, this moment of a man giving her daughter a gift with no expectation attached, and felt her carefully maintained walls begin to crack. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching limestone, Sarah and Jack sat by the planting beds, and Sarah spoke carefully. "You don't have to keep coming here. We're managing." "I know you're managing," Jack said. "That's not why I come." Sarah looked at him. "Why do you come?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "Because I stopped feeling alone when I started coming here. Because your daughter reminds me that loss doesn't mean ending. Because you built something beautiful when everyone said it was impossible. And that gives me hope that other impossible things might be possible too." "Like what?" Sarah asked, though she thought she knew. "Like believing I could be part of a family again," Jack said quietly. "If that's something you'd want. If it's not, I'll understand. I'll still help with the cave. I'll still be Emma's friend. But I need to know if there's a possibility of more, or if I should stop hoping for that." Sarah looked at him, at this man who'd shown up when she was digging in dirt and never questioned her sanity, who'd helped build something the town mocked, who'd stood beside her when mockery turned to grudging respect, who'd made her daughter a wooden horse and took her seriously when she named it Limestone. "I think I'd want that," she said. "I'm afraid to want that because wanting things hasn't worked well for me. But yes, I'd want that." January brought the coldest weather in 20 years. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for 2 weeks. Livestock died. Pipes froze. Families burned through their wood supplies at alarming rates. The town suffered, but they suffered with food, canned goods, root cellars full of potatoes and turnips, and the certainty that spring would eventually come. Sarah's cave remained 58 to 60 degrees. The vegetables grew steadily. By mid-January, she had more lettuce, spinach, and kale than she and Emma could eat. Jack suggested, carefully, that she might share with neighbors. Sarah was hesitant. "They've been calling this project stupid for months. Offering them food feels like proving something." "You're not proving anything," Jack said.
You're just sharing what you have. That's what neighbors do. Sarah started small. She brought fresh lettuce to Mrs. Peterson at the school, enough for the teacher's family. Mrs. Peterson accepted it with visible surprise and something that looked like embarrassment. Then Sarah brought spinach to the widow Davis, who lived alone and was running low on preserved food. Mrs. Davis cried when she saw fresh greens in January. Word spread quietly, not through gossip this time, but through a different network. Need recognizing abundance. The Garrett family, struggling after their root cellar flooded, received kale and carrots. The Morrison family, despite Frank's earlier criticism, received lettuce after their youngest child got sick and needed fresh food. Sarah didn't announce what she was doing. She simply left vegetables on doorsteps with brief notes. From the cave garden, plenty to share. The town's response was complex. Some people accepted the food gratefully and said nothing. Others accepted it and began asking questions. How does a cave stay warm? How do plants grow without sunlight? How is this possible? A few, including Frank Morrison, struggled visibly with cognitive dissonance, accepting food they desperately needed while maintaining publicly that the whole project was still somehow foolish. Jack watched this unfold and said to Sarah one evening, "You're teaching them something more important than agriculture. You're teaching them that being wrong doesn't mean being bad." Sarah looked at him. "What do you mean?" Jack gestured at the cave, the growing plants, the system that shouldn't work, but did. 6 months ago, everyone knew this was impossible. Now they're eating vegetables you grew in February at 20 below. They were wrong, really wrong. But you're not making them feel stupid about it. You're just sharing food. That's generous in a way that goes beyond vegetables. Sarah smiled slightly. "I'm just trying to feed my daughter." "You're doing more than that," Jack said quietly. "And you know it." The turning point came in early February when the Henderson family, who lived on the edge of town, ran out of food. The father, William, had broken his leg in December when he slipped on ice hauling wood. The break was bad, compound fracture, and the doctor in Chalice said it wouldn't heal properly for months. William couldn't work, couldn't split wood, couldn't do any of the physical labor that kept a family going through winter. They depleted their supplies by mid-January, selling what they could to buy food, but money ran out fast, and charity only stretched so far before pride made it impossible to accept more. Their 3 children, aged 4, 7, and 9, went 2 days eating only bread and lard. The youngest stopped asking for more food, which frightened his mother more than crying would have. Pride kept them from asking for help, until Mrs. Henderson, Clara, finally walked to the cave entrance on a cold February morning, desperate and ashamed. She'd argued with herself for 3 days before coming, wrestling with pride and need finally won, only when her youngest son had started looking hollow-eyed and listless. Sarah was inside, harvesting tomatoes that had impossibly ripened in the dead of winter. The cave was warm, 62 degrees, and the smell of living plants filled the air. Clara Henderson stepped through the entrance and stopped completely, unable to process what she was seeing. Green plants, growing vegetables, ripe tomatoes in February. Warmth without burning massive amounts of fuel. She stared at the red fruit, at the green plants, at the warm air rising in the cold February afternoon, and started crying. "I didn't believe it was real," Clara said through tears. "I told people you were wasting time and money. I laughed about it with Helen Porter at the diner. We made jokes about the crazy cave lady. And now my children are hungry, and you're growing tomatoes in February. And I don't understand anything, and I don't deserve help, but I'm begging anyway." Sarah set down her harvest basket, and looked at this woman who'd mocked her, who was now crying in her cave, and felt no satisfaction in vindication, only recognition of what hunger and fear looked like. She filled a large basket with tomatoes, lettuce, spinach, carrots, and kale.
Clara Henderson tried to refuse, even while reaching for it.
"I can't take this. We can't pay." "I was cruel about your project. I don't deserve your kindness." Sarah put the basket firmly in her hands. "Your children are hungry. Nothing else matters. Not the mockery, not the money, not anything except that your children need food, and I have food. Take it." Clara left, crying harder than when she'd arrived, clutching the basket like salvation. And that evening, something fundamental shifted in the town. Mrs. Henderson left crying, and that evening something shifted in the town. The Hendersons told people what had happened, not the hunger, which was shameful, but the tomatoes, which were impossible. Fresh red tomatoes in February at 20 below. Within 3 days, Sarah had a steady stream of visitors, not begging, but asking genuine questions. "How does this work? Could we build something similar? Would you teach us?" Sarah, with Jack's encouragement, began giving informal tours.
She explained geothermal principles, thermal mass, solar gain, insulation strategies. She showed people the water barrels, the rocket stove, the angled glass wall. She let them touch the limestone walls and feel the Earth's stable temperature. Some people grasped it immediately. Others struggled with the cognitive leap required to understand that conventional farming wasn't the only way to grow food. But everyone left with vegetables and a story that would reshape the valley's understanding of what was possible. Jack's role became clearer during these tours. He stood beside Sarah, answering questions, explaining structural details, and gradually, unconsciously, positioning himself as her partner in this project. People noticed. Some with approval, others with judgment. But everyone noticed the way he looked at her when she explained geothermal principles, the way she deferred to him on structural engineering questions, the way Emma moved comfortably between them, like she belonged to both. One evening in late February, after a long day of tours and questions, Emma sat on her cot, wrapping herself in blankets, and asked her mother a question with the directness that only 6-year-olds possessed. "Is Jack going to be my new dad?" Sarah was caught completely off guard, frozen in the act of stoking the rocket stove. "Emma, that's not... It's complicated." Emma considered this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned that adult complications affected children's lives significantly. "Why is it complicated?" she asked. "He's here all the time. He helps us. He's nice. You smile more when he's here. You stopped looking sad when you think I'm not watching." Sarah sat down on the edge of the cot, trying to find words for things she'd barely admitted to herself. "Becoming a family is a big decision," she said carefully. "It's not something that happens just because people spend time together." "But do you want it to happen?" Emma asked. "Do you want Jack to stay?" Sarah looked at her daughter, at this small person who'd survived abandonment and uncertainty and a mother digging in caves, and decided honesty mattered more than caution. "Yes," she said. "I want that." "Does he want it?" Emma asked. "I think so," Sarah said. "But I'm afraid to assume, afraid to want it too much in case it doesn't happen." Emma nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to her. "You should ask him," she said, "like you taught me to ask questions when I don't understand something instead of guessing wrong." Sarah smiled, despite herself. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm 6, Emma said matter-of-factly. "I know lots of things."
That evening, after Emma was asleep, Sarah asked Jack a question she'd been avoiding. "Why are you really here so much?" Jack was quiet for a long moment. "Because I stopped feeling alone when I started coming here. Because your daughter reminds me that loss doesn't mean ending. Because you built something beautiful when everyone said it was impossible. And that gives me hope that other impossible things might be possible too." "Like what?" Sarah asked. "Like believing I could be part of a family again," Jack said quietly. "If that's something you'd want." Sarah looked at him, at this man who'd shown up when she was digging in dirt and never questioned her sanity, who'd helped build something the town mocked, who'd stood beside her when mockery turned to grudging respect. "I think I'd want that," she said. February ended with a thaw. March brought early signs of spring. But the cave garden kept producing, proving its worth not just in crisis but in consistency. By April, 17 families had asked Sarah for advice on building similar structures. By May, 3 cave gardens were under construction in the valley, adapted to different sites but built on the same principles: work with the earth, capture and store heat, and trust that physics doesn't care about convention. Jack proposed in June, kneeling in the cave garden on a warm evening when the outside world had finally remembered what growing season looked like. But inside the cave, it had been growing season since September, proof that seasons were just conventions that physics could overcome. Emma watched from her spot near the tomato plants, not surprised because she'd known this was coming, had perhaps known it before the adults had. Jack held a simple ring, gold band that had belonged to his grandmother, and spoke carefully. "I know this is fast, by some measures. It's only been 10 months since I showed up and asked if you needed help, but I also know that sometimes you recognize what matters quickly, and spending more time being cautious doesn't make it more true, just more delayed. Sarah, you taught me that impossible things become possible when you understand the principles and ignore the mockery. You did that with this cave. I want to do that with us. Build something everyone says won't work and prove them wrong by making it work anyway. I want to be Emma's father if she'll have me. I want to be your husband if you'll have me. I want to build a life with you that works like this garden works, with good principles and steady effort and trust that the math will prove itself true." Sarah looked at him, at this man kneeling in dirt between lettuce rows and tomato stakes, proposing in a cave that shouldn't work but did, and felt absolutely certain. "Yes," she said. Emma applauded, which made them both laugh. They married in August, exactly 1 year after Sarah had stood at the limestone cliff with nothing but a daughter and a memory of her grandfather's words about earth temperature. The town came to the wedding, including people who'd called her foolish, including Frank Morrison, who gave them a set of good dishes and apologized quietly for his earlier certainty. The cave garden produced food through that second winter and for 12 winters after. Sarah continued teaching, informally, showing people how to work with geology and sunlight rather than against winter. Jack expanded his ranch and built a larger geothermal greenhouse using the same principles. Emma grew up in a home that smelled like tomatoes in February and understood from childhood that the best solutions often came from trusting what physics said over what convention assumed. In 1969, a University of Idaho agricultural extension agent wrote a report on vernacular geothermal growing systems in Custer County. He documented Sarah's original cave garden and 23 structures built using her principles over 12 years. His conclusion was direct. Mitchell's innovation extended the growing season indefinitely, reduced food insecurity, and demonstrated that geothermal principles could be applied successfully by non-specialists using salvaged materials and basic construction skills. The design's adoption correlates directly with crisis-driven necessity and personal testimony, rather than institutional validation. In other words, people believed it when they got hungry enough to try, and it worked well enough that they taught their neighbors. Sarah Mitchell Hendricks passed away in 2004 at the age of 76. Her obituary in the Chalice Messenger mentioned her teaching career, her family, and her work in sustainable agriculture. But locals remembered something different. They remembered the winter when a woman everyone mocked grew tomatoes in February at 20 below and taught a town that the best answer to hardship isn't always the conventional one. That being abandoned doesn't mean being defeated, and that sometimes the person everyone doubts is the only one who understands what actually matters. She wasn't being stubborn. She wasn't being reckless. She was being practical. And sometimes practical looks impossible until you taste a tomato in February and realize the impossible just required someone brave enough to try.